everybody, and welcome back to the question where you have the questions and I have the answers. And I know I have not filmed in a very long time. Honestly, I was feeling very uninspired and down with myself, and it's hard to get motivated during this pandemic. Uh, we still don't know the full psychological, mental, ramifications of being isolated for so long, and lack of motivation seems to be one of those factors. Also because I just wasn't like, I don't know, I've had so many other social medias now, not so many, but like I'm more active on Instagram and TikTok, and I kind of just didn't, because it's a lot more work to make a YouTube video. I have to do all the research to know what I'm talking about, and I just wasn't really loving anything that I was talking about. And while it's all important things I talk about, because my last few videos were about slavery and all of that, I just wasn't feeling inspired. But then I saw a TikTok, ironically, about Victoria Woodhull, and I was like, let's talk about the suffragist movement, because there are a lot of famous people, key people from key suffragists, and they were all very different, and we only learn about a few of them, and we only learn the good things about a few of them. And I feel like we need to talk about all of them, the good and the bad, because no one is perfect. No one is perfect. I think we've especially learned that this year, is that someone can have all these really great beliefs but still have beliefs that are kind of really bad. So let's start with the big one, Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was, I think she's the most known for the women's rights movement, especially the suffragist movement, because she was like the face of that movement. She was the one giving all the speeches. She was the one, at all of these conventions speaking. She was actually an abolitionist when she was growing up. Her family was. And so they also worked to push the 13th Amendment, which was the Emancipation Proclamation. However, she lobbied against the 14th and 15th Amendments, which would give people of color the right to vote. And the reason that she did that, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who I'll talk about later, also advocated against it, was because they felt that black people should not have the right to vote if white women didn't have the right to vote, and which is really, really fucked up and really racist. But we don't talk about that a lot. And but even though they did have those racist views, they did do a lot for the movement. However, between the two, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who I will talk about now, was the brains behind the operation. Even though she wasn't publicly leading any of the movements, she was the one writing all the speeches and organizing everything. And the reason she was different is because, well, Susan B. Anthony remained unmarried. Also, by the way, she was arrested for illegally voting in 1872 because women didn't have the right to vote, but she voted anyway, and so they arrested her. And they fined her with like $100, which she never paid. Yeah, anyway, Susan B. Anthony was never married, and she was able to move around the country and give these speeches. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton was married, and she had, I think, like 4 kids. And so she was able to write the speeches, but she couldn't go and deliver them. But she was a very intellectual woman. She actually never went to college. She went to Covenant to become a nun, but apparently the religion was so cult-like, she became like traumatized by it, and she hated organized religion for the rest of her life. But also there's a big rift between the two, because you always talk about them being together, but actually for a long time they weren't. And the reason was that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, even though she was also racist, also lobbied against the 14th Amendment not being passed. She believed in women's reproductive rights, and so she would advocate for sexual freedom and for women to have forms of birth control. I guess she didn't like having 4 kids. No, that's a joke. And the suffragist movement, the main one, didn't like that because they thought that they would be asking for too much, that it was too radical, that people wouldn't take them seriously, and they already had a hard enough time, getting respect and being able to speak at these functions, They didn't need like something else to complicate that and ruin those chances for. Also, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an advocate for legal divorce for women, because women at the time could not get divorced. Only the husband could get a divorce. Only men could get a divorce. And even then, women didn't have full divorce rights until the late 80s under Ronald Reagan. And also, neither of them lived long enough to be able to vote. They both died in like 1902 and 1904 respectively, but they were really big, like two of the biggest names of the suffragist movement. Even though, once again, they were racist, they weren't perfect, they did push this a lot, especially since they lobbied again for it at a federal level, but their main contribution was getting states to approve women's right to vote. And I'm going to talk about Alice Paul, who was the main person who got the 19th Amendment, which is women's right to vote at a federal level. That came later, because once again, they died in 1902 and 1904, respectively. Alice Paul was actually from England, was raised in that suffragist movement and all of these different, equality functions in England. And then she came to America, and she was way more like intense in her method. She wasn't there giving speeches, she wasn't there holding functions. She was the one leading the picket movements outside of the White House. She was the one holding the hunger strikes after they were arrested for picketing the White House, which is violating the First Amendment, by the way. And she also was a very, very smart. She was educated. She had a PhD in sociology. So she knew how to use the publicity to her advantage and to the advantage of those in the suffragist movement. So she, basically, what happened was she and other suffragists would picket outside of the White House, stand saying that, they deserve the right to vote. How can we be fighting overseas? Because this is happening during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, which means also World War I. And I was like, why are we fighting people's rights overseas when not everybody has rights here? Not everyone is equal here, so why are we involved in some other country? And instead of, giving them rights, he arrested them for peacefully picketing outside of the White House for some made-up thing like disrupting traffic, even though there were like barely any cars then. And when they were in jail, she started the hunger strike. Basically, they would starve themselves, they wouldn't eat, and so they were force-fed. And if people could get pictures or reports of them being force-fed that went to the news, it pointed out, what a terrible person, what a terrible president Woodrow Wilson was being, and how they were violating the Constitution, and all of this just to suppress some women so they couldn't vote. And eventually, he let them out, and he gave them the right to vote just so he wouldn't seem like a terrible person. And because they were like, yeah, we could, if more women are, voting, maybe they'll vote for me, and maybe we can, vote for, it could be like a war effort thing. But yeah, no accounts on her being racist, but also, I don't know, there's not much about that. At least nothing notable. Now to Victoria Woodhull. We're going to go back in time, actually, because she happened a bit before Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And she did not come from as prominent of families as Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Stanton, and Alice Paul. Her father was a con artist, and they grew up going from place to place. She and her sister were clairvoyants, so they could see the future, and that was how they scam people, was they would go and say, oh, we can read your future, and all those kinds of things, She got married at the age of 15, just to escape her dad, who would beat her and her sister sometimes. So they moved to Chicago, Cincinnati, then to New York. She divorced her husband because he would beat her, and he was an alcoholic, and he would cheat on her. Got remarried, and she and her sister, who continued the uh, spirit talking, medium business, became the mediums of Vanderbilt, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who is the railroad tycoon, and he helped them get with the stock market, which made them the first brokers, female brokers of Wall Street. And this gave her her platform because she also started the first women-run newspaper, and where she could talk about how women needed sexual freedom, not just to pursue, like, her talks of sexual freedom was the basis for the gay rights movement, like, was built off of that. She advocated, you should be able to love who you love, you should be able to legally have sex and marry who you love, and you should also be able to pursue relationships for as long or as short as you choose. You should be able to leave the person without social ostracization, you know, because women, if they were divorced, were seen as like outcasts, like they failed in their wifely duties, and therefore were not as accepted in society. And she was a divorced woman. She divorced one more time after all of this happens. But and so she was like, well, if you're gay, if you're bi, you should be able to marry. This also included interracial marriages and interracial love, because that was also a big no-no at the time. Because they thought that if, we blended the races, then eventually there would be no more race. It'd just all be one big, like, blob of race and not individual races. And so she was like, you should be able to love who you are despite of race, despite, it did not matter who it was you were loving as long as you could love them, and you should be able to divorce and get married and not be expected to stay with one person your entire life. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they supported her at the beginning. At the beginning, but it took a turn. And here's why. Because at the beginning, it was like, oh yeah, women have the right to vote, but women should also have the right to be, seen as equals in society. And that was something that they were all for. But also, another thing, okay, I'm like telling this so wrong. But also, what got them was Victoria Woodhull was very blunt and sometimes would attract bad publicity because of the really blunt things. So she also advocated for sexual education, which was once again something that we already know Susan B. Anthony did not like because they ostracized Elizabeth Stanton for the same thing. But also another thing Victoria Woodhull, and something that she is most famous for, is she was the first female candidate for president. And it's very controversial about whether she was an actual candidate because legally she received 0 popular votes and 0 electoral votes. However, there were 2,000 votes that were cast but weren't cast for any of the other candidates, and people are assuming that they were cast for her and her party. Another reason it's controversial whether she actually ran for president was because she was under 35, and the Constitution states that you need to be at least 35 in order to run for president. But she was nominated by her party, and she did have a campaign, and her running mate, who, even though he was not aware that he was until after the fact, was Frederick Douglass, who, by the way, supported all of the women that I'm talking about today. So that if she had won, she would have been our first female president, and Frederick Douglass would have been the first black vice president. But she didn't win. Also, fun fact, she was in jail on election day. And the reason why is because, once again, she was very blunt in her newspaper. And at one point, it became less about education and advocating, and it was more just calling out the hypocrisy and the corruption and the fraud that was going on in the stock market. And so that went from like corrupt congressional land deals, monopolies, all of that. And one thing that she wrote about was this affair between this prominent high-class woman and this man who's Mr. I think it was like Jonathan Breacher, who was the brother of 2 suffragists. And the reason it was scandalous was because she called him out and she said, you always talk about, you support me, you say that you believe in all of these things, but then you don't. And you are allowed to cheat on people, and you are seen as, this is your conquest, this is your right as a man is to go and have affairs that's expected of you. But then if I am divorced and I remarried and I'm seen as a whore, you know. Another thing that Susan B. Anthony did not approve of, neither did the suffragists, was that one, she published the article, but also she was an advocate for legal prostitution and vegetarianism. I don't know why vegetarianism was bad, but they didn't like it. But also legal prostitution, which was bad. We still can't agree on that. But anyway, she was arrested for the article because it was seen as scandalous and untrue. But eventually so she was held for a month, she, her sister, and her husband. And later she had to pay a $500,000 fine, which was a lot today, but it was definitely a lot back then. This is like 1872. So yeah, she lost the election. I think Ulysses Grant, who was already president, just won re-election, which was a bad idea. But you know how that goes. So her husband divorced her again. She moved to England and continued there, but she tried to distance herself from her more radical, like younger phases, and got more into eugenics because one of her children was disabled and she was entirely ableist. I'm not gonna put it bluntly. She was completely ableist. She was better in some respects than Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the fact that she wasn't racist, but she was ableist, and we cannot overlook that. Yeah, so that's that. Now I'm going to talk about Ida B. Wells, who deserves so much more credit because we talk about the women's right to vote and the suffragist movement. We always talk about white people, and the last four people I talked about were white. Ida B. Wells is black. She was born on a plantation. She was born as a slave, but the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect 6 months after she was born. So honestly, long enough for it to like heavily impact her. But also, she still lived in Mississippi, which they just got rid of the Confederate flag as their state flag. That should say something. But yeah, so she wrote the occasional piece about, anti-racism and everything, but it didn't really begin to matter to her until she bought a first-class ticket for a train, but was still forced into the back of the train with the African-American seats, like Rosa Parks, but on a train. And she refused. She fought, she kicked, she bit, she was arrested, and that was when she dedicated her life to looking at the inequality and writing about it and advocating for change. And she was a suffragist because she wanted women's right to vote, but she also wanted equality. And she was she's most known for her anti-lynching activism, because she said, and I'm totally gonna misquote this, that lynching was like the most legal crime. It was like America's national crime. It was murder. It's amoral, but everyone does it and everyone is okay with it. It happens daily, and it was like a sport to them. And so she would go to the White House, she would talk about this, she would help picket. Another thing I forgot about Victoria Woodhull, sorry to backtrack, was that she actually spoke at a convention arguing that women already had the right to vote, they just had to use it. And here's why. Because the 14th and 15th Amendment guaranteed everybody had the right to vote, which we now take to mean just black people, not men, had the right to vote, but there was never any gender distinguished. It never explicitly stated only men, and so she was like, well, you say everybody, all citizens, women are citizens, we should be able to vote. And that's when they said, no, women are not full citizens, so you can't vote. Anyway, back to Ida B. Wells. So yeah, she would go around and look into each anti-lynching case across the country and write articles about them saying how wrong it was and why it's happening, and how even though you freed the slaves, that doesn't make us full respected citizens just as everybody else. And she was hated in the South. They burned down her house, her newsroom. They said, we will kill you if you come back here. So she stayed in New York. She also was the co-founder of the NAACP, which is still around today. which is super impressive, though she did distance herself from it because she said at the time it was too small of an organization and wasn't active enough to make any real difference. But I feel like she'd be proud of it today. The reason I talk about Ida B. Wells and I talk about these other people is because there's a new statue in uh, New York, and it was like, oh, this is the first statue of women in Central Park, and it's Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Sojourner Truth, all debating at a like talking at a table, and I was like, okay, I was like, that's nice, that's nice. Throughout, Ida B. Wells and Victoria Woodhull and all these other people, other black activists who fought for women's right to vote and for, all these other things, And I feel bad that these other people don't get as much recognition as they deserve. And even though they are not perfect in any way, shape, or forms, as I said, Victoria Woodhull was ableist, and no one's perfect, but they did all come together to help forward equality in this country. Whether equality for all or just equality for one group, it's still a vast improvement than how it was. Not a linear improvement, obviously, but they had an idea, they had a dream, and none of them lived to see its fruition. Actually, Alice Paul and Ida B. Wells did. They did live long enough to be able to vote. Because Alice Paul died in 1977. Isn't that interesting? Our parents were alive with Alice Paul, which is also sad because that means women's rights have only been on for like 100 years, which sucks. And Ida B. Wells died in 1931, so she's also old enough, lived long enough to be able to vote. She also ran for Illinois Senate, but she died before she could be elected, if she was ever going to be elected. This went into kind of a ramble, by the way. That's just something I want to talk about. Learning about different parts of history is really important to me, and it bothers me that when we talk about the suffragist movement, we only talk about Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton, and we talk about them as if they're these untouchable heroes, when they actually... It was a lot more messy than we talk about. History is a lot more messy, and no one is wholly good, no one is wholly evil. And so they did a lot of good for a lot of women, but not a lot of good for the black community. And it sucks. So anyway, have a nice day. Have a nice Thanksgiving weekend. I love you all. So long and thanks for the fish. And party on, my dudes. Ah, it's not turning off.